Okay, so there's one more really important concept that I want to talk a little bit about before we start chapter 6. So this is one that the Genki book introduced a little while ago, but we wanted to hold off on it for a little bit so that we could focus on getting the sentence structures together. But it is kind of an important concept for when we get into chapter 6, so I want to kind of introduce it and get us thinking about it now. So you may remember that when we first introduced verbs, we talked about two main kinds of forms. So we have like a short form and a long form. That's what Genki calls them. If you've looked at another textbook before, you might have heard of like plain form and polite form. It's the same concept. So short form is what we use at the end of our sentences in casual speech, whereas long form is what we use at the end of our sentences in polite speech. We usually use short form with our friends and our family, whereas we might use the long form with people we don't know that well, with people who are older than us, with people who have higher social status, like your teacher or a customer at work or your boss at work. We also sometimes see short form used in things like newspaper articles where we have to save a lot of space, and diaries, where we're pretty much writing to ourselves. Whereas we might see long form in things like letters, because we want to like maximize like our politeness when we're writing. So we'll get a lot more in depth about how to use the short form next semester. But one thing that I do want to talk about the short form is how we can use it to sort verbs into three main categories. So once again, we have like a present tense, a past tense, negative present, and a negative past for both short form and long form in Japanese. So in our long form, we have like the mas form is our present tense. And the negative is something called masen. We also learned mashita for the past and masen deshita for the negative past. So we have mas for what we do, masen for what we don't do, mashita for what we did do, and masen deshita for what we didn't do. We are going to talk just briefly about the present tense of the short form today. And the present tense of the short form is called the dictionary form. The reason it's called the dictionary form is because it's just what you would find in the dictionary. Or in our case, it's what you would find on the vocab list in Genki. So in the dictionary form, we have three main types of verbs. Our first kind are do verbs. And as you might guess from the name, these are verbs that end in the hiragana do. We also could think of these verbs as quote-unquote end replacement verbs. So these are verbs where when we conjugate them in any way, we change them from having a do at the end. We just get rid of the do and replace it with something else. So some examples of do verbs that we have studied are okiru and miru. What do you think these verbs are in the mas form? That's right, this is okimasu and mimasu. We also have some u verbs. These we call the quote-unquote sound transformation verbs. So these are verbs that end in u, tsu, do, bu, mu, nu, ku, gu, or su. So these are basically, they end in some other u sound. And these are verbs where we have to change the sound whenever we want to conjugate them. So some examples of u verbs are iku, yomu, hanasu, and kaeru. What do you think that is in mas form? Iku. That's ikimasu. Yomu, yomimasu. Hanasu, hanashimasu. And kaeru, this is kaerimasu. Now, I know that kaeru also ends in the particle ru. So this is something that we will talk about a little bit more. So there are some verbs that end in ru that we just kind of have to be careful of. So these are ones that we just have to learn. We also have some irregular verbs in Japanese, but the good news is that unlike languages like English or Spanish or French, which have dozens of irregular verbs, in Japanese we only have 2. So these are the only 2 verbs that are irregular: suru and kuru. So as long as we just memorize these 2 and their conjugations, then it can be really easy to figure out the verb conjugation in Japanese, because these are the only ones that are special. So suru is the short form, the dictionary form of shimasu, and kuru is the dictionary form of kimasu. So once again, we have 3 types of verbs in Japanese. We have ru verbs, u verbs, and irregular verbs. So ru verbs always end in ru, u verbs can end in any syllable, and our irregular verbs are just the 2, suru and kuru. So when we want to change a ru verb to the mas form, so far we have just kind of memorized all of our verbs in the mas form, but from now on, we're going to work on memorizing verbs in the dictionary form, and we can learn to turn them into mas form. So when we want to change a ru verb to mas form, all we have to do is get rid of the ru and put mas. It's very straightforward. So any conjugation that we do with a ru verb, we're going to be getting rid of the ru and replacing it with something else. So okiru, if we want to make it mas form, we just change it to okimasu. How about neru? What do you think? Nemasu. How about taberu? How can we change it? Tabemasu. And miru, how can we change it? Mimasu. That's right. So okiru, drop the ru, add mas, okimasu. Neru, nemasu. Taberu, tabemasu. Miru, mimasu. It's very straightforward. For our irregular verbs, these are the ones that we just have to memorize. Thankfully, once again, there's only the 2. So kuru, we change to kimasu, and suru, we change to shimasu. So this is just a straight up change that we just have to remember. Last comes our u verbs. These are a little bit trickier, but the pattern is still pretty basic. So this is a little bit easier to picture in Romaji than it is to picture in katakana, or in hiragana. So I wrote this out in Romaji for us to look at. So we have iku, it ends with ku, like the consonant is k and the vowel is u. So when we change an u verb to mas form, what we want to do is get rid of this vowel u and replace it with the vowel e. So all of our different forms of u verbs will involve changing the vowel that is the last vowel in the word. So instead of iku, we change to iki. With kaeru, instead of kaeru, we change to kaeri. For kiku, instead of kiku, we'll change to kiki. For nomu, instead of nomu, we change to nomi. Hanasu is a little bit tricky. So we could just change this u to an e, but the problem is we don't have hanasi. We don't have a c in Japanese. So we have to change to hanashi. Hanashi. And yomu, we change mu to mi. So let's take a look. 行く, 行き, and then we want to add the ending mas. So our mas form is 行きます. 帰る, 帰り. Mas form is 帰ります. 聞く, 聞き. Mas form is 聞きます. 飲む, 飲み. Mas form is 飲みます. 話す, 話し. Again, we have to go with she because we don't have a C in Japanese. 話, 話します. 読む, 読み, 読みます. So basically what we are doing is we are changing the last sound from the u row of hiragana to the i row of hiragana and adding mas. So we change from iku, hanasu, nomu, kaeru to iki, hanashi, nomi, kaeri, and we add mas onto the ending. Ikimasu. Hanashimasu. Nomimasu. Kaerimasu. Once again, 行き、行く、行きます。話す、話します。飲む、飲みます。帰る、帰ります。We are changing an U sound to an E sound. So let's take a look at these verbs that we have here. So these are all verbs that we have studied in the past. We memorized them in the mas form. So you can take a look. If you want, you can look at your vocab list in Genki, where they are all listed under the type of verb that they are. So let's take a look at your vocab lists in Genki, and let's see if we can figure out which type of verb, which verb and which type of verb all of these different verbs that we have studied before are. You can take a minute to pause the video if you need some time to work on it. Okay, let's take a look together. So this is to go to the library. This is iku, it's an u verb. Here we have to come, kuru, is an irregular verb. Next, to go home, kaeru, this is an u verb. It's a little weird because it ends in the hiragana ru. This is one of our kind of weird exceptions. We just have to remember, kaeru is an u verb. How about this? Taberu is a ru verb. How about nomu? An u verb. How about miru? Miru is a ru verb. How about yomu? Yomu is an u verb. How about kiku? Kiku is an u verb. How about hanasu? Hanasu is also an u verb. Okiru? Okiru is a ru verb. Neru? Neru is a ru verb. Suru? Suru is an irregular verb. And benkyou suru. This one, it's just like a description, like benkyou, study, added on to suru. So this one is also an irregular verb. Benkyou suru. So, We will deal a little bit more with the different types of verbs in the coming chapter. But for now, I just want you to start to be aware of the different types that each of our verbs fits under, and to start getting aware of how we can take our basic dictionary forms, like we have on the vocab list in Genki, and turn them into the different constructions that we have made.